Before we start, a little reminder to hit the subscribe button. Just 4% of my channel is subscribed. For generations, the Galactic Society had laughed at Earth, a backwater planet filled with weak, primitive species who barely understood space. Travel. The Council of Dominion, a ruling council of the most powerful civilizations, didn't even bother acknowledging Earth as a viable civilization. They were weak. They were unimportant. They were nothing. At least, that's what the galaxy believed. Then, the Zarari Empire committed a mistake. The Zarari, a species notorious for its cruel conquest, had crushed hundreds of worlds, leaving only smoldering ruins and enslaved survivors in their wake. Their six-limbed war creatures, standing twice the size of the typical human, were developed for one purpose: destruction. Their warships darkened the sky of entire worlds, wiping away opposition in days. So, when they turned their ravenous gaze toward Earth, the Council scarcely reacted. "Let them take it," the Corvian ambassador had mocked. "Humans are nothing but hairless apes. If the Zarari wish to waste their resources, let them." It was expected to be an easy invasion, a minor formality before another banner was raised under the Zarari Empire. But the moment the first Zarari ships entered the Sol system, something went awry. The Zarari command vessel, the Unyielding Wrath, led the charge, massive, bristling with weaponry, and ringed by a fleet of destroyers. It should have been an unstoppable force. Their warriors braced themselves for the killing, their tusks polished, their claws sharpened. They were prepared for battle, but they weren't prepared for what happened next. Within seconds after their arrival, a single communication was relayed to the Zarari fleet. No human battleship had even launched yet. No defenses had fired. The message was simple: "Turn around. You do not grasp what you are about to awaken." The Zarari commanders scoffed. Arrogance was in their blood. They answered with their own message, replete with scorn and threats. Then they heard the laughs. It was human laughing, but something about it was wrong, distorted, layered. It came via their communication systems, even after they cut the line. It resonated inside their helmets, inside their ships, burrowing under their exoskeletons. Like an infestation. Their translator systems sought to analyze it. Failed. Tried again. The laughing twisted, deepened, and the words that followed weren't in any known human tongue. The sound emanated from everywhere. And then, one by one, systems started shutting down. The Zarari hurried to reset controllers, but every time they restored a function, another failed. Weapon systems were the first to go. Shields next, and then the lights. Total darkness fell upon the Unyielding Wrath. Only the emergency crimson glow remained, showering the towering battle creatures in frightening illumination. The Zarari warriors, peerless in battle, suddenly sensed something strange to them: fear. Then came the whispers. At first, they thought it was just their own team, but the voices came from inside their helmets, speaking in their own language. Words that made no sense, words that distorted their own brains. One warrior yelled, tore off his helmet. Another collapsed to his knees, clutching at his own. Eyes wailing about the ones that live in the dark. No one knew what he meant. The ship's sensors flickered back online for only a moment, long enough to identify anything moving. Not ships, not missiles. Something else. Something inconceivable. They were inside the ship. The Zarari have never seen a human yet. They had expected resistance, expected weapons, expected desperate calls for mercy. They had not expected this. The attack had barely yet begun, and already the Zarari were losing. Panic spread like wildfire among the Unyielding Wrath. The Zarari were warriors, conquerors, creatures forged in the fires of everlasting conflict. They had crushed entire civilizations without a second thought. Yet now, in the depths of their own flagship, they shook. The whispers slithered through their helmets, through their armor, through their very thoughts. Words that made no sense. Words that felt wrong. "They are watching. You should have turned back. Now it's too late." The ship's leader, Overlord Garen, slapped his clawed fist into the control console, seeking to reestablish order. "Enough of this," he yelled. "Get the lights back on. Find the source of these signals and shut them down." His engineer rushed to obey, but every system they tried to restore flickered and died, as if something was within the spacecraft, tearing it apart from the inside out. The communication from Earth came again. This time, it wasn't a warning. It was a question. "Do you know what your predecessors did?" The bridge crew exchanged worried glances. Predecessors? What predecessors? The Zarari had never encountered humans before. As far as they knew, Earth was a new target, an easy conquest. Overlord Garen scoffed and spat back a response. "We do not care. Your race will kneel before us or burn," the laughs returned. But this time, it wasn't just distorted sounds. This time, the laughing came from behind them. One of the bridge cops turned, his mandibles clicking anxiously. His eyes expanded. His entire body froze in place. "Oh." Overlord Garen turned around. There was something standing at the back of the bridge. Not human, not alien. A shadow. A thing with no face. Yet it felt like it was grinning. It towered over them, stretching abnormally tall, its form flickering like static on a broken screen. The bridge cops seized their firearms and fired. Plasma shots slashed through the air, passed right through the figure, and impacted the walls behind it. The shadow didn't react. Then it made a stride ahead. The nearest officer dropped his pistol and collapsed on the ground, convulsing. His eyes rolled back. His breathing slowed. Then, without a sound, he stopped moving. Dead. Garen felt his instincts scream at him to run, but he was a Zarari warlord. He did not run. With a sneer, he screamed orders. "Get me a boarding crew. If these humans have some kind of telepathic trick, we'll rip their skulls from their—" The ship tilted. Not because of a weapon hit, not because of an external force, but because something was pulling them. "Overlord!" one of the engineers yelled. We're moving toward Earth's surface. Our thrusters aren't responding." Garen slapped his claws upon the control panel. "Fire the reverse boosters." "We can't. Everything is offline." The ship accelerated. Through the enormous viewport, Earth grew wider and larger, its blue surface now shining with a weird, eerie light. And in orbit, just outside the planet's atmosphere, there were wrecks, hundreds of them. Zarari battleships, Dominion, vessels, remnants of fleets long considered missing. Silent, abandoned husks, lingering in endless orbit around Earth like a graveyard. Garen's eyes widened, his mandibles twitched. The realization eventually dawned. This wasn't the first time someone has tried to invade Earth, and no one had ever returned. Then, just as the ship's hull began to quiver from atmospheric entry, the voices returned one last time. "You were warned." The ship dropped, and Earth finally opened its jaws. The Zarari warships screamed through Earth's atmosphere, their hulls blazing as they fought against the invisible force tugging them down. The unyielding wrath, once a symbol of invincible conquest, now sank like a wounded beast. Alarms wailed over the ship. Warriors grabbed to anything they could find while the world outside spun in a blur of fire and turmoil. Overlord Garen yelled above the noise, "Brace for impact!" Then everything shattered. The flagship blasted into the surface, metal screeching as it carved a mile-long tunnel into the Earth. Smoke and flame rose from the wreckage. The once mighty vessel was now little more than a broken husk. Smaller Zarari ships smashed. Around it, some detonating on impact, others vanishing mid-air, as if they had just ceased to exist. Yet, despite the carnage, Garen was still alive. Pain tortured his body as he dragged himself from the debris. His vision clouded. His ears rang. Around him, Zarari warriors groaned and stumbled from the carnage. Some barely clung to life. Others were crushed beneath the wrecked metal. But something was awry. It wasn't simply the crash, it was the silence. There was no resistance waiting for them. No human army around the wreck. No aircraft bombing their position. No sign that Earth's defenses even acknowledged their arrival. And yet, the air felt heavy, like somebody was watching. Garen stumbled forward, his claws sinking into the soil. He engaged his communicator. "Command, this is Overlord Garen. We have crashed, but we are still working, requesting quick extraction." Static. He tried again. "Command, respond." Only the same sound came back, but buried among the static, deep and distant, was breathing. Slow, measured, listening. Then a voice. "You should not have come here." Garen's breath seized in his throat. It wasn't human. It wasn't Zarari. It was something else. Then one of his warriors screamed. Garen whirled toward the sound. A soldier, massive and battle-hardened, had slumped to his knees. His armor meant to endure the worst circumstances in the cosmos was dissolving. No. He was melting. His exoskeleton beneath it disintegrated in real time, flesh sloughing from bone, mandibles crumbling into black dust. And suddenly, he was gone. Not dead, not even a body remaining. Just gone. The other Zar'ari recoiled. Their warrior impulses warred with something basic inside them. Dread. What? What is this? One of them growled. Then they heard the footsteps. Not human, not alien, just footsteps coming from the ruins. From the shadows. From nowhere and everywhere at once. Then followed the laughing. The same laughs from the ship. Warped. Endless. Wrong. Shapes moved in the darkness. And for the first time in his life, Overlord Garen felt actual horror, because he finally understood. This planet was not weak. It was never feeble. It was a trap, and they had walked straight into it. The Zar'ari, the galaxy's most dreaded conquerors, had never known a true opponent. They had experienced opposition before, but resistance was predictable. Soldiers, weapons, defenses, nothing they couldn't crush. But this was something else. Overlord Garen stood still, his claws twitching around the handle of his plasma blade. Around him, his warriors fanned out, weapons lifted, scouring the smoke-filled battlefield. Wreckage dotted the ground, fires flared across the night sky, and the air was dense with the fragrance of burning metal. But there were no human soldiers, no incoming airstrikes, just shadows and whispers. You are not the first. The voice slithered through the air, through their helmets, inside their heads. Some warriors yanked their helmets off, desperate to escape the cacophony. But there was no escape. A soldier near Garen twitched. He staggered, dropping his rifle, claws burrowing into his own skull as his breathing went ragged. His mandibles clicked irregularly, his eyes unfocused. "Overlord," the warrior rasped. "I hear them. Inside. His body convulsed. Then, without warning, his head wrenched backward at an unimaginable position. A horrible crunch resonated through the battlefield. He dropped. Lifeless. Garen's throat clenched. "Spread out! Stay alert!" The remaining warriors obeyed, taking defensive positions around the ruins. Their plasma weapons flashed in the darkness, scanning for any sign of movement. Then one of them fired. A dazzling bolt of energy darted into the cloud. The collision lit up the battlefield for a fraction of a second, revealing nothing. No enemy, no figure, but the soldier who fired. His body twitched fiercely. He was yanked backward, drawn into the shadows by an unknown force. His shouts lasted only a heartbeat before being quiet. The warriors panicked. They fired into the darkness, plasma bolts searing the terrain but hitting nothing. The air thickened. The ground beneath them felt wrong, as if they weren't standing on solid soil anymore, but something alive. Then the ground moved. It rippled beneath their feet, throbbing like the flesh of some gigantic, invisible beast. The air filled with a deep, rhythmic sound. Not a growl, not a roar, but breathing. Something ancient, something enormous, something observing them. Garen's mind raced. This wasn't a battlefield, it was a graveyard. "You were warned," the voice whispered again. Garen gritted his fangs. "What are you?" he yelled into the comms. Silence. Then, finally, a response. "We were here before you, before your type, before the council, before the stars themselves, and yet you arrived, as they always do." Garen's blood ran cold. They had thought Earth was just another primitive world, but this planet, it wasn't merely guarded. It was alive. And it remembered. A warrior near Garen suddenly screamed. He turned just in time to see the soldier's body twisted. His exoskeleton shifted, disintegrating as his body expanded into something alien. His limbs elongated, his mandibles split apart, his eyes turned absolutely black. Then, in a single jerky motion, he stood up again. But it was no longer him. It tilted its head toward Garen. And when it grinned, he knew. They had never been fighting humans. They had been fighting Earth itself. And Earth had already triumphed. Garen staggered back. His warrior instincts shouted at him to run, to fight, to do something. But how did one battle a planet? How did one conquer something that became its enemy? The soldier who had just transformed, his former comrade, took a step forward. His movements were awkward, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. His mandibles contorted into something that shouldn't have been a smile. And his voice, when it came, was layered. a distortion of his own tone combined with others. Many others. You hear them, don't you? The monster that had once been a warrior murmured. More shouts erupted around them. The Zerari forces, hardened murderers who had conquered many worlds, were being picked off one by one. Some were pulled into the shadows. Others simply changed. Their bodies twisted, their thoughts taken, their voices melding into the ever-growing chorus of whispers. Garen's mind raced. This couldn't be genuine. This has to be some form of advanced human weapon. Psionics, mind warfare, hallucinations. It had to be. But the globe itself pulsed beneath his feet. The air swelled with unseen eyes. The sky itself seemed to darken despite the burning. No, this was no human deception. This was something older, something waiting. A harsh click resonated behind him. Garen turned, his plasma sword blazing in a burst of blue light. One of his warriors, a veteran, a survivor of 100 campaigns, stood before him, trembling. His rifle was raised, but not at an opponent. At him. "Overlord," the soldier muttered, his breath strained, his body quivering uncontrollably. I hear them inside." With a swift, savage movement, the warrior pushed the barrel of his weapon beneath his own jaw and pressed the trigger. A flare of green plasma. A terrible hiss. His body crumbled, and the whispers became louder. Garen's breathing went shallow. He had to regroup, had to do something. His gaze darted across the battlefield, searching for survivors. Most of his forces were already gone, taken, eaten, or worse. But a handful of warriors still adhered to their training, building a defensive circle around the ruins of the unyielding wrath. He raced toward them. "Fall back to the ship," he yelled. "We make our stand there." The remaining warriors complied, retiring toward the damaged hull of their once mighty flagship. They weren't thinking about triumph anymore. Only survival. But when they reached the debris, a grim reality crept over them. The ship was transforming. Its metal hull, once a proud exhibition of Zarari engineering, was distorting, twisting, throbbing like living flesh. Strange veins flowed down its surface, black and throbbing, as if the planet itself was consuming it. One of the warriors hesitated. "Overlord, the ship?" A wet, tearing sound cut him off. Something arose from the wreckage. It had no name, no true shape. It was the ship. It was the battlefield. It was Earth, and it had no intention of letting them depart. Garen finally understood. They had been so pompous. They had thought Earth was weak, but the reason no one had ever conquered this world wasn't because it lacked defenses. It was because it didn't need them. This planet did not surrender. This planet did not bow. This planet fed, and now the Zarari would become part of it. Forever. Garen's claws clenched around his plasma blade, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't make a difference. Nothing would. This planet had already triumphed. The entity emerging from the wreckage was unlike anything he had ever seen. A mass of changing, writhing material, half metal, part flesh, and something else. The remains of the unyielding wrath twisted into it, twisting and reforming like a ship being devoured from the inside. No, not consumed, transformed. And suddenly it opened its eyes. Thousands of them. Black, empty voids peering. In every direction at once. A dreadful creeping awareness slithered down Garen's spine. The ship wasn't being consumed. It was becoming part of Earth. A deep, horrible voice rumbled from the thing. Not a voice in the way beings spoke. No sound, no vibration. It was something deeper. Something that spoke inside him. "We remember you." The Zarari soldiers recoiled. One of them shouted, launching a wild volley of plasma fire at the changing monstrosity. The bolts of energy impacted the mass, scorching holes in it, only for the wounds to breathe and close. And then the warrior who fired the shots gasped. His plasma gun disintegrated in his hands. His armor tightened against his exoskeleton. He looked down. His body was melting into itself. He tried to scream, but his mouth sealed shut. His limbs bowed at inconceivable angles, his figure curling inward, shrinking, until he was no longer a soldier at all, just a chunk of something, writhing, shifting, changing. Then he was gone. And the creature with 1,000 Eyes laughed. Garen turned to his remaining warriors. "We're leaving now," he said. But Overlord... Now he triggered the emergency beacon on his wrist. There were still Zerari ships in orbit. He didn't know if they had got his distress signal, but he didn't care. He refused to die here. He refused to become part of whatever this was. The remaining Zerari ran toward the edge of the battlefield, their enormous bodies cutting through the smoke and devastation. The rumors followed them. The air pulled at them. "You were warned." One of the warriors abruptly vanished mid-stride. 1 second, jogging by Garen, the next moment, gone, as if he had never been there at all. No scream, no sound, just obliterated. Garen didn't stop. He could see it now. The ruin of a landing craft, half buried in the ground. If they could get airborne only for a second, they could escape. He reached there first, pushing his clawed hands against the hatch. "Get inside!" The surviving warriors scrambled inside the spacecraft, their breathing strained, their thoughts cracking. Garen followed last, pounding his fist against the control panel. The engines flickered, then sputtered, then died. A long, slow sigh filled the air around them. Not from a creature, not from a being, but from Earth itself. The sky above darkened deeper, the stars fading one by one. And then, something moved. Not in the debris, not in the shadows, but beneath the planet's surface. Something ancient, something enormous, something waking up. Garen gritted his fangs. No, he would not die here. With a yell, he ripped the emergency panel from the control console, exposing the naked wiring beneath. His claws flashed against it. The ship trembled, and against all chances, the engines roared to life. The landing craft lurched into the air, shuddering fiercely as it fought against the attraction of the planet. The surviving warriors clutched to anything they could. The ground below trembled, twisted like a living creature, as if the very land itself was reaching for them. But they were already rising higher, higher. The smoke dispersed, showing the wreckage-strewn battlefield beneath them. And in the center of it, a shape gazed up at them. The monstrosity that had once been the unyielding wrath was no longer just a ship. It was something else now, something watching, something smiling. Garen refused to stare at it any longer. He concentrated his attention on the sky above, on the abyss, on the hope that if they could just get past the atmosphere. The ship's sensors flared to life. A transmission crackled through. "This is the battleship Eternal Dominion in high orbit. Overlord Garen, do you copy?" Garen nearly fainted from relief. "We copy. Immediate retrieval. Do not land." "What happened down there?" the voice on the other end questioned. "Our scanners detected no enemy activity, just static." Garen's mandibles clenched. How could he explain? How could he put into words the horror that had unfolded? "Do not attack this planet," he eventually murmured, his voice lifeless. "Do not return. Do not send scouts. Do not even look at it." Silence. Then, "Understood, Overlord." Garen closed his eyes. "Burn the records. Mark this world as banned, and never speak of it again." The transmission cut. The landing craft broke through the atmosphere, escaping the clutches of the planet below. Garen didn't glance back. He never wanted to see Earth again. But Earth saw him, and it remembered. It always remembered. Because Earth was not feeble. Earth was not prey. Earth was something else entirely. And the cosmos would never comprehend why. No one ever returned, because the ones who did, they were never the same again. Even after exiting Earth's atmosphere, Garen could still sense it. The whispering had stopped, but their echoes lingered in his memory. The darkness of space should have been comforting. A return to the cold, uncaring void he had always known. But something about the stars felt strange now. He had seen things no fighter should see, and Earth had seen him back. The landing craft floated into the docking port of the Eternal Dominion, one of the Zerari Empire's most powerful warships. The surviving warriors, what little remained of them, stumbled out, their expressions empty, their limbs trembling. They were the lucky ones. Some had not escaped. Some had changed. And some had simply ceased to be. Garen had participated in wars before. He had seen fighters crushed, burned, torn apart. He had never seen an army unmade. The Ship's commander, High Warlord Kak, waited for him at the bay entrance, a towering Zerari with an obsidian-black exoskeleton. Kak was a legend among their people. He took one look at Garen and grimaced. "You look like you crawled out of a grave." Garen's mandibles trembled. "That would have been preferable." Kak's attention went to the surviving warriors. "This is all that remains of your invasion force?" Garen nodded. "And it was never an invasion. It was an execution." Kak's eyes narrowed. "Explain." Garen opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. How did he characterize what had happened? How did he explain that a planet had consumed his army? Instead, he simply remarked, "We need to leave. Now." Kak folded his arms. "We don't run from backwater planets. The invasion fleet is still en route." "We need to call them back," Garen yelled, his voice trembling. "Do not let them step foot on that world. Do not even let them orbit it." Kak's mandibles trembled with annoyance. "You're panicked. That is not the way of a warlord." Garen seized him by the armor, his claws biting into the plating. "I witnessed warriors dissolve. I watched our strongest fighters turn into things. I watched our ship become part of the Earth itself. You don't comprehend, Kak. We didn't find a defenseless world. We found something waiting for us." Kak's patience faded. His clawed hand flew up, grasping Garen's wrist. "Get a hold of yourself. You sound like a mad—" A low murmur permeated the air. Kak froze. So did Garen. The sound wasn't coming from the ship's engines. It wasn't from the docking bay machinery. It was coming from inside them. One of the surviving soldiers sank to his knees, his entire body shivering violently. His mandibles twitched. His eyes, once blazing and golden, turned entirely dark. And then he laughed, the same twisted, broken laughter that had tormented the comms. The air in the docking port grew heavy. The lights dimmed, not from a defect, but from something else. The warriors stepped back, their weapons uplifted. But Garen already knew. They hadn't escaped Earth. Earth had arrived with them, and it was still hungry. The laughing sent a shock of frigid horror through the Zerari soldiers. It wasn't simply coming from the soldier on his knees. It was spreading. The sound piled itself, like if 100 voices spoke beneath it, getting deeper, closer. Then, the fallen warrior's body began to transform. His exoskeleton broke, cracking like dried leather. His limbs trembled, elongating slightly. His claws curled unnaturally. His breathing turned raspy, moist. And then he lifted his head. His bright eyes were gone. Only black gaps remained. Garen's hold on Kak intensified. "Do you believe me now?" Kak was silent. The altered warrior struggled to his feet, his stance incorrect. He gazed around the docking port, tilting his head as if listening to something no one else could hear. Then he smiled. "It's still watching." Kak drew his plasma gun and shot. The missile hit the creature square in the chest, blazing straight through its armor. It should have dropped. It should have died. But instead, it laughed again. The hole in its chest moved, sealing over as if the wound had never existed. The creature flexed its claws, glancing down at its own body like a child evaluating a new toy. Then it made a stride ahead. "Contain it!" Kak shouted, knocking Garen back and aiming for another shot. The other warriors followed suit, their weapons flashing to life. Plasma bolts smashed into the thing's body, searing its exoskeleton. But it did not fall. It grew. Its form twisted. The black gaps in its eyes widened, expanding outward like cracks in reality itself. And suddenly, the docking bay shouted. Not the warriors, not the beast, the ship itself. The walls groaned, metal twisting and breathing. The floor, underneath them, pulsed. The whole air shuddered, rippling like troubled water. The eternal dominion was evolving, becoming something else. "You brought it with you," the monster hissed. One of the warriors broke. He turned, rushing for the blast doors toward escape, but before he could reach it, the door melted into flesh and opened an eye. The warrior's scream was cut short as the door swallowed him. Garen's mind whirled. No, this wasn't feasible. They had escaped. They were in orbit, light years distant from that wretched world. But the reality was apparent. They had never left Earth, because Earth had never been just a planet. It was something else. And now it was spreading. The thing that had Once been a Zarari warrior let out a slow, contented breath. Then it turned its focus to Garen. You never should have come. Garen felt something inside him break. This wasn't just an invasion gone bad. This was an infection. And now, it was in their fleet, in their empire, and soon, it would be everywhere. Garen had never felt true hopelessness before. He has fought fights where the odds were against him, stood against attackers that outnumbered him 10-1, survived conflicts that had crushed entire civilizations. But this was something else. His claws twitched on the handle of his plasma blade, not from a fear. He had accepted dread long ago, but because some deep, basic part of him knew this struggle had already been lost. The creature that had once been his warrior took another step forward, its mandibles spread in a horrible parody of a Zarari expression. Its eyes, those empty voids, fixated on him. And then it spoke. You think you escaped? The voices came from inside his mind, crawling beneath his exoskeleton, slithering into every gap of his thinking. You brought us with you. Around him, the docking bay breathed. The walls expanded and contracted, the metal groaning as if becoming something organic. The ship was transforming, becoming part of it. Kak, still standing alongside him, let out a slow exhale. Overlord, tell me this is a nightmare. Garen didn't answer, because it wasn't. The changed Zarari warrior lunged, faster than he should have been, faster than anything should have been. Garen barely reacted in time. His plasma blade blazed to life, swinging upward. The blade cut clean through the thing's torso, splitting it in half. For a fraction of a second, he felt relief. Then it laughed. The torn halves writhed, dark tendrils crawling through the air, bringing themselves back together. The wound healed as if it had never been there at all. Cox snarled, "Fall back, now!" The remaining warriors turned and ran. Not because they were cowards. Zarari did not withdraw. But this was not an enemy they could fight. This was not an adversary at all. This was a plague. I hope you appreciate story, so it's my pleasure to some comment on this story. Like and subscribe this channel.